Hey, Steve Saretsky here. As always, the Canadian real estate market update with a particular focus on Vancouver. If you get any sort of value entertainment out of these videos, all I ask that you hit thumbs up and subscribe. Any questions, comments, put those below and we'll banter back and forth. As always, sort of talking Vancouver markets, BC, and looking from the more global macro perspective. There's only so much you can talk about from real estates from a micro level because at the end of the day, they are very slow moving. So it's important to sort of look at maybe more macro forces that can sort of impact those markets from a bigger picture. And that tends to be what we focus on here. First and foremost, I'll jump into some of the BC real estate data for July. This is a continuing trend. BC real estate sales fell 24% year over year in July. That was the actually fewest amount of sales since July of 2012. So it's a 6-year low for BC home sales. Same thing with dollar volumes, which is the amount actually spent on real estate. That also declined by 24% year over year. That's going to have a huge impact for the BC government tax revenues. Obviously, we know how dependent they are on the housing market. But yeah, I mean, this is much more widespread than Vancouver. And as I've talked about, I get a lot of questions. People asking me, hey, what's going to happen in Kelowna? I live in Victoria. What's happening here? Is it what's happening in Vancouver going to transpire into my market? And as I've said from the get-go, that all these markets are interconnected to quite a large degree. And particularly as the economy, the global economy has become more and more financialized, how banks create mortgage products, how they securitize them and sell them off. People don't understand is a huge one of the biggest purchasers of Canadian covered mortgage bonds are European pension funds. So, those are the real foreign buyers basically funding your mortgages here locally. So all these markets are basically interconnected. And you were starting to see that in the BC numbers. Vancouver, obviously, an 18-year low in home sales in July. They were down 29% year over year, but Kelowna down 23%. Victoria had a decline of 19%, and Fraser Valley dropped 34% year over year. So, that slowdown is coming. I know some of those areas are a little bit more price sensitive. They haven't necessarily come down. That's what I'm hearing, at least in Victoria. But I think it's really just in due time as Vancouver comes off. Obviously, we know what's happening in the detached space. We've now talked about how the condos are down 5, 6, 7% in some of these areas. So, you keep an eye on that. But again, this sort of plays into a bigger perspective as a lot of things that influence these markets. And I think that's really what's important to focus on. Huge influx, depending on where you are in the credit cycle and what other central banks and economies are doing. We obviously, Vancouver in particular as a global city was heavily influenced by an outflow of Chinese capital, particularly as they devalued the the yuan. There was a huge outflow of foreign capital into global assets, and one of them was obviously Vancouver. And you can see that just with China's forex reserves plunging back in 2015, all that money that was coming out. But that's really started to seize up, and it's really not so much to do with a local foreign buyers tax here, but China has really clamped down on their capital outflows. They are trying to beef up their reserves. They're basically in a currency war here with the United States. So these are bigger implications. All you have to do, and then you can see that starting to reflect in the local data here. So the BC government just released their foreign buyers statistics for the first half of 2018, so from January to June. The number of foreign buyers based on transactions, they accounted for 1% of all transactions in Greater Vancouver. So again, I know there's going to be a lot of people that are upset and say that's not the accurate number. We know that. Canada is very generous giving out permanent residency status. They give it out like it's candy on Halloween night. We know that. But at the end of the day, as you can see, even the foreign buyers numbers, I think at one point they're around 10% of transactions. That was sort of pre-foreign buyer tax. I believe in Richmond, which is a huge Chinese ethnicity. Foreign buyers were around 18% of transactions back in early 2016. So you can see that number really coming off, and today Richmond's at like 3% for the first half of this year. So and you're seeing that's just a multitude of factors: detached sales at 27-year lows, etc. But this again really brings us back to a slowing housing markets globally that are also impacted by foreign capital. Manhattan's slowing, London is slowing, Australia, Sydney, Melbourne are slowing. So there's a global slowdown that really ultimately comes from being later in the credit cycle. Central banks obviously hiking rates. What the United States is doing is having a lot of impact on global credit markets. Canada is so obviously showing signs of being in the late cycle. July inflation came in at 3% in July, so it was the highest consumer price goods since 2011. So Canadian inflation rate is at 3% in July. Grossly outpaced expectations. The Bank of Canada has a target rate of 2%, so they have inflation running hot at 3%. They have to hike rates now, so they're basically in a rock and a hard place. You have a slowing housing market, you have record high household debt, and here you are at late cycle, record low or lowest unemployment in the last 10 years, wage inflation rampant, as I talked about in my video last week, and now you have consumer price inflation at the highest it's been since 2011. It's just incredible to watch. It really forces their hand, so we'll be watching for them to either hike in September, October. And it's almost like the market sort of forces them, right? As the news came out that the Canadian inflation's at 3%, the loonie jumps up. People start pricing that in because they know that the central bank has to hike interest rates. And it's crazy to think, because at the end of the day, your inflation rate's at 3%, and they're still at 1.5%. So those are still effectively real negative interest rates. They're way too far behind the curve. But again, as they're hiking interest rates on top of really sky-high house prices nationally, record-high household debt amongst the G20, that is going to ultimately slow the economy here moving forward. And again, this is pretty much textbook late cycle, as we've talked about ad nauseum. So I won't get too much into that, but that's I think very important and critical to watch moving forward. And that's pretty much all I got this week. I think those are some pretty big pieces to watch. I think next week we'll talk about some of the national house prices, national sales for July. But the big story here this week is to see the slowdown ripple across the entire province of BC. At the same time, you still here have crazy low unemployment, wage growth rampant, inflation running hot, which is going to force the Bank of Canada's hand moving forward here in the next month or two. All right, hope that helped. See you soon.